But secondly, they think that the rich should pay on a sliding scale. The tuition should be the same percentage of everyone's income. These attitudes perhaps do reflect that particular period, up to 1998, where the whole top 20% of Californians moved ahead in income. At that point, you could say the top 12.5% should pay the cost of being in the top 20%, or at least more of it, when 20% are really getting ahead. But what people don't know is that today, and since 1998, the top 1% have pulled ahead of the top 20%. What they don't know is that in the last 3 years before the economic crash, before the state budget cut, 35 or 40% of all of the income of the top 20% was earned by the top 1%. Twice as high a proportion as 10 years before. For them, tuitions of $10,000 or even $20,000 are merely a cap on the cost of higher education. But if Californians in the top 20% are essentially stagnant except for the top 1%, well, then the Pipit poll would have a very interesting result. It turns out that the average income in the top 1% is $1.8 million a year, which means if everyone paid the same proportion of their income in tuition, those people would pay about $1 million a year to attend UC. That's how unequal California's income distribution has become. In other words, the whole theory that you have been sold as a structural necessity for funding higher education out of private debt rather than tax revenue, as a structural necessity, simply reflects the economic conjuncture of the years up to 1998. And what people don't know, because they haven't been told, is that since UC decided to privatize since 2003, they don't know how rich the very richest have gotten. I've said that the average income in the top 1% is 1.8 million, which is 50 times the wealth of the income of the 50th percentile, twice as high as it was in the 1995 to 1998 period. I've said that over 30% of all income gains now go to the top 1%. I've said that within the top 1% there is a reported gain of $128,000 per taxpayer per year, and that the top 1% now pays 30% of all income tax. In other words, incomes, the tax base, is so unequal that if we had a tax-supported rather than a debt-supported system of higher education, according to my colleagues, the median taxpayer would pay exactly $32 more on his tax return or her tax return in order to roll UC tuition back to $4,500 a year. The difference, of course, is that the rich would pay so much that the average tax return would go up by about 3.7 thousand. But only about the top 1.5% would pay more than a few $100s, because that's how unequal incomes really are in California. So why are so many people willing to incur so much debt, up to $100,000 in total, to avoid burdening so few taxpayers? Because they still believe that UC is a tax subsidy to the rich, rather than regarding a debt-funded UC as a tax savings for the rich. In fact, the runaway income inequality of California that was once a pretext for privatizing college education, higher education, has gone so far, the inequality has become so skewed, that very few people, 95% of the people, would not bear any burden for restoring higher education to its public mission, both in terms of quality and in terms of affordability. UC is trying to get you and all Californians to believe that the argument for debt funding rather than tax funding is structural, inevitable. My argument is that it's conjunctural and easily rebutted. Here's the timeline. In 20 years between Proposition 13, 1978, and 1998, all income gains in California went to the top 20%, and the tax base shrinks. For example, corporations now pay no taxes. They used to pay about 25% of all taxes. 1998 to 2003, after it gets this data, UC increases its enrollments by 40%. That's tidal wave 2. And then plans to leverage its ability to charge this 40% additional enrollment 10% tuition increases a year, and goes out on the bond markets to tout this ability, partly in order to build a new campus based on its credit rating. Pivotal year, 2003. Two things happen in 2003. First, Arnold Schwarzenegger is elected governor and signs a compact with UC, giving it a green light to raise tuition, regardless of whether state funds go up or down. Second, 2003 through 2008, for the period of runaway securitization of private debt, both the home loan and the student loan market, which leads to the crash of 2008. Third thing that happens in 2003, 2008, is that the incomes of the top 1% go through the roof and everyone else is left behind. The Bush era. My message today then is very simple. It's that higher education is on the agenda because of your protest, and that you must not lose sight of your message, which is a different message based on a different theory than UC's. UC's theory is that higher education is a driver for income inequality and can leverage income inequality in order to finance future growth. Your message must be a message that puts UC on the side of greater equality and makes its success a driver of greater equality. You, the student and faculty, are in a good position to make UC's issue a poster child for what's wrong with the entire theory on which UC's current financial plan depends, a theory that assumes that society is growing ever more unequal and that contributes to that inequality. And what this means, if we're going to reverse this trend, is that it means we must place principle first. We are not simply campaigning for lower prices for a service that you consume, higher education. We need to attack the idea, which has been common since the end of the Cold War, especially in the Third World. The real problem with being poor is that you can't borrow enough. So prime lending, in other words, is a way to make the poor feel richer by impoverishing them further in a context where overall income inequality continues to grow. Between 1989 and 2008, throughout the world, in the post-Cold War years, the idea is simply that you can escape poverty by debt, and that if you can be sold on the idea that credit is expanding, you will not demand redistributive taxation and a welfare state, and you will certainly not demand a revolution.